Up then. Yeah, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. There's an enormous, you'll probably hear an enormous electrical storm brewing in Johannesburg, so hopefully we don't get any interruptions. But yeah, if we do cut out for any reason, you'll know why. Yeah, so today I'm going to be picking out some of the works that I find particularly interesting, mainly from the evening session on Wednesday. So it would be the final session in the third catalogue for those of you that have your sort of triple volume catalogues at hand. But I will be focusing more specifically on mid-century sculpture. In the 1950s, here we go. In the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, there was an incredible, exciting explosion of fantastic sculptural works, three-dimensional works, mainly on the Highveld. I'll skim through. Hold on. I'll skim through some of the examples sort of coming from this golden period that we have in our sale. I think you'll maybe notice at a glance that stylistically there are many sort of great leaps between them, but there are many others that have very, very close similarities. I will naturally spend some time on individual works today, draw out some particular points around them. But perhaps more importantly, I'd like to paint a far broader picture to give you some contextual understanding in terms of what was going on, particularly here on the Highveld when it comes to sculptural works. You'll notice in works like these a very distinct spirit of Africa, a clear Africanness in many of these works, whereas in others you'll notice an influence from further afield, and specifically British modernism. I'd also like to introduce you to some of the major players, the movers and shakers, the artists themselves, the gallerists, the important figures during this period, starting, of course, with the endlessly suave, super cool Edoardo Villa, born in Bergamo in Italy in 1915. He came to South Africa as a POW during the Second World War and never really returned to Italy, certainly not permanently. This is him in his garden in Kew. Some of you would have been to his home. It's an amazing place, an amazing sculptural garden, an amazing studio, now owned by Warren Siebrits. Ezrom Legae, another major force during this period, born in Vredendorp in 1938, a major figure at Polly Street and Jubilee Centre as a teacher as well as an artist. Sidney Kumalo, one of the great giants of 20th century modernism in South Africa, born 3 years before Ezrom Legae. Sidney was born in Sophiatown, also a major player at Polly Street and Jubilee Art Centre. Cecil Scottness, born to missionary parents in East London, slightly younger generation, enormously important. And I think although he is a household name, doesn't get nearly the kind of credit he deserves. I can't think of many greater forces in 20th century South African art than Cecil Scottness. That is across printmaking, sculpture, as well as teaching. Other major influences, maybe influences you'd never quite expect, would include Lynn Chadwick, born in 1914 in Barnes in London. Kenneth Armitage, who attended Leeds as well as the Slade School, part of the famed Geometry of Fear group, this small group of post-war British modernists that caused an enormous storm in the 1950s and 60s. One of them being Elizabeth Frink, having attended the Guildford School, as well as the Chelsea School of Art, as brooding with a sort of pot hairstyle in her studio amongst these skeletons and bones and all these different armatures that she was working on as a young artist, as well as two other mega figures of 20th century British modernism, Barbara Hepworth and of course Henry Moore. Now, we don't actually have any works by Hepworth or Moore in this sale, but I needed to mention them because their influence is undeniable during this period. These two are the other major movers and shakers in this period. The gentleman on the right is Egon Günther, and the very suave lady on the left with her big glasses, who sadly passed away now about 6 weeks ago, is Linda Givon, perhaps known better as Linda Goodman of the Goodman Gallery. Starting with Egon Günther, because he is another figure that doesn't get the kind of credit he deserves in terms of his all-round influence, particularly on the Highveld in the 60s and 70s. He was a German immigrant. He started a gallery in Mannheim in Germany after the Second World War. This is him on the right in his gallery. Just look at the kind of works he was showing, the kind of artists he was linked with. He was absolutely instilled in out-and-out German expressionism. He was on the cutting edge. Even his gallery, directly after the war, Gallery Egon Günther, was a major European player, selected very soon after its inauguration as one of the major dealers and galleries in Europe at the time. What kind of artist was he dealing with? Well, artists like this, mind-blowing artists, textbook artists, artists like Max Beckmann, Otto Dix, Paul Klee, Oskar Kokoschka, Emil Nolde, Max Pechstein. These are household names globally. Not to mention hugely influential within our own South African circles. I'm speaking specifically in terms of their influence on the likes of Irma Stern and Maggie Loubser, who were both directly linked to some of these artists at the time. Egon Günther was also a passionate scholar, academic, dealer, and collector of African art. He had a number of terms for what he described as exotic African art. These are often quite loaded terms now, difficult to always put across the exact title and terminology, but I think we all have an understanding of what we mean by African art. Egon's personal preference, the kind of works he collected originally tended to be West African and Central African works, like some of the ones I'm showing you here. And remarkably, what he did was he showed these African works in the same context, in the same spaces as these fantastic German expressionist painters that I've just showed you earlier. He found his love of African art from a man called Hans Himmerhuber, who was an enormously important anthropologist as well as an art dealer. He spent time all through Africa in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, studying works, seeing how they were produced, trying to understand their cultural background. He really turned the study of African art on its head with, I suppose, very serious analysis. But he was also the first out-and-out freelance African dealer. He was not linked to any major institution, but rather he bought, traded, sold items around the world. And many major galleries around the globe have works originally purchased from him in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And he met Egon Günther in 1946, and he became a massive influence on Egon Günther's sort of own preferences. This, of course, is from 1948. We're back in South Africa here, the Nationalist Party coming to power. And this is shortly before Egon Günther immigrates to South Africa. He arrives in 1951. And a little bit later, 1957, I think it is, he sets up the Egon Günther Gallery in Connaught Mansions on Bree Street in Johannesburg. You can see his signage here. He set it up first as a gallery, but he was primarily a jeweler by trade. He was probably dealing more in jewelry at the time. But he also started looking very carefully at the local art market, meeting artists. He had met Cecil Scottness a little prior to this in 1954, 1955, and he started establishing a stable of local Johannesburg and Pretoria-based artists. Again, he would show them alongside other African artifacts that he would purchase, not only at auction, but also from small-time dealers around Johannesburg and Pretoria. Later on in 1965, he has a purpose-built home gallery built in Crown Street in Linksfield. This is him in 1965 with a very, very famous Cecil Scottness doors that you see in the background. And this really became his base from 1965 onwards. Those of you who are lucky enough to have visited this home, I think you'd probably all agree that is one of the most special places, not just in Johannesburg, but in the country. It is one of the most beautifully curated spaces, warm, historically important, a magical space that is still lived in by Egon's daughter. In the meantime, in the 1950s, there was a network of local artists developing. At the time, really focused around someone like Cecil Scottness, and this is him on the left with his tie on. He was a major teacher at the Polly Street Centre in Johannesburg, which is one of the only places where non-white students could work and learn and practice art making. Cecil is there on the left with a very young artist. You'll, I doubt, ever recognize him, but that is a young Ezrom Gatani. Sydney Kumalo came under Cecil Scottness's wing at the Polly Street Centre in the late 1950s. And there Sydney is in the middle there. And Scottness essentially taught him, helped him with his early sculptural steps, and also helped him with his first important commissions. At the time, there was also very close link to Edoardo Villa. As a young sculptor, Sydney Kumalo got a huge amount of guidance and mentorship in terms of steel armature building from Edoardo Villa in his studio at the time, as did Ezrom Legae a little bit later. Anyway, these kind of artists naturally gravitate to Egon Günther. And in the early 1960s, out of his gallery in Bree Street, he pulls together a group of artists which have now been known, at the time even were known as the Amadlozi group. And originally they included the likes of Giuseppe Cattaneo, Sydney Kumalo, Cecily Sash, Cecil Scottness, and Edoardo Villa. There a much wider circle developed after that, including the likes of Hannes Haars and Peter Hayden, Ormiston, as well as Ezrom Legae, who joined in 1966. But the kind of works that linked these artists were the ones I'm showing you here. So there's Giuseppe Cattaneo, Sydney Kumalo, his famous, fabulous black leopard from 1962 with its wonderful rasped surfaces, a really primeval kind of figure. It doesn't look like a leopard, but it just feels like one. Cecily Sash, and we have this fantastic monotone work in the upcoming sale. Cecil Scottness, of course, who I've spoken about already, and Edoardo Villa producing an incredible heraldic sculpture like the one I'm showing you here. These artists all exhibited together under the Amadlozi banner in Bree Street in October 1963. And then Egon Günther did something quite remarkable. He arranged international exhibitions for the Amadlozi group, and their work toured Rome, it toured Florence, Milan, and Venice. Incidentally, some of these artists that I'm speaking specifically about, Scottness, Villa, and Kumalo, were also featured in major biennales, the Venice Biennale, the Sao Paulo Biennale at the time. So they were starting to become, I suppose, major international figures, which I think is enormously interesting. Egon Günther essentially repeated in South Africa what he had tried, or what he had achieved in Germany in the aftermath of the war. Of course, in Germany from about 1933 onwards, the German avant-garde was entirely maligned. In fact, it was essentially obliterated. And when Egon started his gallery after the war, one of his major goals was to take German avant-garde painting and art making to the rest of the world and to the rest of Europe. And he does exactly the same thing with this Amadlozi group in the mid-1960s. And another aside, I suppose I would like to make is that it is so sad that despite these artists being on the verge of international stardom, it was essentially taken away from them in the intervening years, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, where the cultural embargo took such a massive toll on our artists. This Ezrom Legae, I told you, he joins a little bit later in 1967. Egon Günther has and arranges solo shows for these artists. Edoardo Villa in 62, 63, 68, Kumalo in 62, 63, 67, 66 and 67, and then Legae in 1966, shortly before he joins the group in 1967. So that's a bit of a broad context, and we have a number of works from this fabulous mid-1960s golden period. I'm showing you three of them here. The work on the left, Kneeling Figure by Sidney Kumalo, Lying Nude by Ezrom Legae. Both of these works are from 1965, and this fabulous cylindrical torso by Edoardo Villa from 1968. I see I'm missing the D there. These are all wonderful in their own right. I think you'd agree with me that they are still linked. Yes, there's an African spirit, which was something that the Amadlozi had in common, and something that Egon Günther found very, very important and always wanted to draw out from his artists. He felt that that artwork, quality artwork, needed to reflect its time, but also its location. And that was something he emphasized dramatically with his stable of artists. But also in works like this, you start to see these sort of strange segmented limbs, often stubby or contorted, other times elongated, I suppose broadly abstract, but always very evocative. I'd like to think that all of these artists, all of these works have sort of major international precedents. And to give you, I suppose, some kind of visual example, compare, say, Sidney Kumalo's Kneeling Figure with this fantastic work by Henri Gaudier-Brzeska, produced in 1913. Gaudier-Brzeska, of course, died in 1915, very, very young. Look at Ezrom Legae's Lying Nude and compare it to the incredible Alberto Giacometti from 1932, the very famous woman with her throat cut. And then Edoardo Villa, his torso compared to this male torso by Brancusi, a concept that he really developed from about 1917 to 1922. I love these kind of international links. Anyway, staying in the mid-1960s, staying in this golden period, I have to spend some time talking about this work. This is Mandala #1. This is arguably the most important sculpture to come to market for some time. It's certainly one of the most important items to come to market in the last few years. It is quite incredible. It's an item, I think, that will generate interest at auction, but also in academic circles. It was conceived in 1966, and it is part of this fantastic phase between 1966 and 1968 that Kumalo goes through, this wonderful period of creativity where he is using the male elder as inspiration. You know, the male elder with all its connotations of wisdom and calm and understanding and peace. Sidney Kumalo takes this motif and develops this fantastic range of small yet monumental sculptures during this period. The first four that he conceives in 1966 include this one, a work called High Shoulders, this work called Beggar, and this work called Tongue Out. They have rather strange names. You'll see these images are relatively old and not in particularly good quality, and that is partly because these works are so enormously rare. A very small number of them were ever produced, and they certainly don't come on the market very often. The other work he conceived and produced in 1966 was our wonderful Mandala number 1. Other works that were produced in 66 and 67 included this one, Mandala number 2, hands on chin, Mandala number 3, chin on knees, Mandala number 4, pierced ears, Mandala number 5, large face, Mandala number 6, a much larger work that we were lucky enough to sell, I think about a year or two ago, fantastic work, Mandala number 7, Happy Mandala, and then The Listener from 1968. So this is this magical Mandala series produced between 1966 and 1968. In many cases, editions of 10 were planned for most of these, but I can't think of a single one where the edition was completed. In most cases, 1, 2, perhaps 3 of each bronze was actually cast at the Vignali foundry. Anyway, on that score, our Mandala number 1 from an edition of 10 is the only casting ever made of the work. It is a unique casting. It is numbered number 1 of 10, and numbers 2 to 10 were never completed. So it is a unique work, which just adds to the magic around it. It comes from the late Desmond Fisher collection. It would have been purchased shortly after it was produced in the late 1960s and has been in that family collection ever since. It's one of those works that we would describe as being rediscovered, a work previously lost that is so enormously exciting for academics and collectors alike. What are we looking at? In terms of broad influences, think about Egon Günther's interest in African art. Look at the item on the left. And these were figures that Ezrom Legae and Sidney Kumalo would have seen in the collection and in the home of Egon Günther, and to which, by all accounts, they were very energetically drawn towards. The second work here, very similar in terms of its elongated form, is a work from about 1957 by Cecil Scottness, and then the work on the right, a work by Edoardo Villa. And I think you'll see the very clear links between all of these works, the same kind of influential energies going on the Highveld around Egon Günther in the mid-1960s. Look at these sort of deep cuts and V's, not only between the breasts, but around the navel in Mandala number 1. And you can see something similar here in Edoardo Villa's vertical form. I love the deep set eyes. I love the sort of barreled nose, these pursed lips, the sort of double conical chin that is mirrored in these sort of drooping breasts. I love these little arms pressed tightly to this very taut torso with its beautiful patina, hand rasp, beautifully pockmarked and scarified. Also this very strange pose, this weight heavy on the right knee, these very stiff toes on the left foot propping this figure up. It is gentle in many ways. You get a sense of this elder figure sort of gently looking up, catching the sun in some kind of memory, a happy memory. But it's certainly an incredibly beautifully produced item in itself. It has Egon Günther written all over it in terms of the quality of execution, bearing in mind his background as a jeweler. Another major work from this period is by Ezrom Legae. It was conceived in 1968 as a work called Young Man, or perhaps more evocatively, The Prisoner. I'll give you a few views. You can see the figure's arms tied behind its back. It's nude, of course, almost a robotic head. Reminds me very much of Jacob Epstein, his famous rock drill produced in 1913, this mechanical power in the way a figure is conceived and produced. I think depending on who you speak to, and certainly if you speak to someone like Dr. Gavin Watkins, who is very much the preeminent Ezrom Legae scholar, he would always identify this work as, if not Ezrom's most important, and certainly one of his most important works. In many ways, it's very simple. It is a nude figure edited at the shin bones, looking up. It is a prisoner. He is bound. There is an element of oppression. There is a deep sadness. There is a deep desperation and despair. But of course, there is a very real dignity in this figure. And that's really what elevates the work as a more objective study of a prisoner or a downtrodden figure to one that, transcends those kind of difficulties. I won't read all of this, but I'll give you just a few lines written by Carl Nell in a recent catalogue talking about this work. He talks about the torso itself formed by two parallel and conjoined cylinders, a deep groove running from the stylized penis at the base of the groin, cutting a vertical axis into the chest. At the base of the neck, the groove transforms into a cylinder within a long column of the neck. The grooves on either side of the windpipe and the pronounced Adam's apple speak of the tensions in his body as he tilts his head to his right. Is an axial groove reasserting itself in the face, collapsing of the features, the face turned into a deep V-shaped groove terminating at the forehead. I love the language Carl and Liz Burrows use when describing this work. There are elements of the mechanical in it, talking about cylinders and cones. Also, of course, reminds you of the kind of language that scholars will always use when describing the works by Cézanne in particular. The other thing I have to say about The Prisoner is that it fits into a group of works that are iconic 20th century resistance pieces in South Africa. I would put it in the same category as Gerard Sekoto's famous Song of the Pig, produced in 1947. I'm showing it to you here on the right. These are the same spirited works. This is all about resistance, about defiance, about dignity, about power. And I think that is so fantastic. It's I would argue, quite a small elite group, but Prisoner is very much part of it. Here is another work that I would put into that genre, a work called The Scream by Dumile Feni, produced in 1966. Of course, it calls to mind Edvard Munch's similarly titled work, The Scream, from 2 generations prior. This African scream, talking very much to the political climate at the time. I would also put The Prisoner in the same kind of category as Peter Clarke's fabulous Sandy Bay. And I'll talk about Peter Clarke a little bit later, but he is always resistant, even if perhaps more gentle than some of these other artists I'm showing you. I'd also put The Prisoner in the same kind of ballpark as the famous Butcher Boys by Jane Alexander, a work in the Zico National Gallery in Cape Town, a work that is always on display, on permanent display, a work that really needs to be seen to be believed in terms of its raw power, its disarming nature. And I think it has a lot in common with Ezrom Legae's fabulous Prisoner. I'd also put The Prisoner alongside History on a Monument by Penny Siopis, also produced in the late 1980s, as well as some of William Kentridge's best and most politically charged works, like this fabulous Casper's Full of Love, which is in our upcoming auction. And it was amazing to hear about this work from Wilhelm van Rensburg in a talk yesterday or the day before, as well as David Krut, the printmaker and publisher that knows so much about it. Anyway, Ezrom Legae and Sidney Kumalo, despite being arguably the most, or some of the most important mid-century modernists that the country has produced, have surprisingly never received any real academic interest, no major retrospectives, very, very few curated shows until recently. I'm showing you an in situ shot of the Ezrom Legae rooms at the Norval Foundation, curated by Professor Carl Nell, and this was the first retrospective of Ezrom Legae's work, as well as Sidney Kumalo's work, and I'll show you an image of that in a moment. This was, to me, a completely unforgettable show. I imagine when I'm 80 or 90 years old, thinking back on my career. I'll never forget going to see the show at the Norval Foundation. It was the inaugural show at the Norval, and it was remarkable in so many ways. Most importantly, of course, contextualizing these two fabulous artists alongside Edoardo Villa and showing some of their most brutal and spectacular works altogether. To end off on The Prisoner, I couldn't help but show you this little slightly blurry shot from the inside of the Gunther home in Linksfield. You'll see, I suppose, what the home / museum almost looks like at the moment. This would have been Egon's sort of live-in gallery, and you can see here his casting of The Prisoner or Young Man by Ezrom Legae. Here's the sort of in situ shot of the Sydney Kumalo rooms at the same show. The show is accompanied by this incredible catalogue called Rediscovery and Memory, talking about the works of Kumalo, Legae, Villa, and Serge Nitageka, a fabulous landmark show. Here again, looking into the Kumalo rooms, you'll see here Madala number 6. Anyway, things start changing quite dramatically in the middle of the 1960s, and I mean that in terms of influence. And it has a lot to do with this very slick young lady with a cigarette in her mouth. This is, of course, a young Linda Givon or Linda Goodman. And she, alongside this bearded gentleman on the left, Eric Esterek, played a major role in the lives of these sculptors at the time. Now, Eric Esterek, an American gallerist, had galleries in Mayfair and London, as well as in New York, showing and selling works around the world, a major player at Biennales. And he took an interest in the Ahmedlozzi stable, the artists working around Egon Gunther in the mid-1960s. And in 1964 and in 1965, Eric Esterek and Linda Givon, who was working for him at the time, make a trip to Johannesburg to meet Egon Gunther. And here they are in Linksfield, Eric Esterek on the left, Sydney Kumalo in the center, and Egon Gunther on the right. And they are discussing ways of broadening the Ahmedlozzi markets, taking these artists international, showing them in New York, showing them in London, showing them around the world. And this is a enormously important moment in the history of South African modernism. Eric Esterek, of course, was selling an enormous number of major European and British contemporary artists and modernists, including the likes of Chadwick and Elizabeth Frink, as well as sort of mega European artists like Picasso and Braque and British artists like Hockney. That's where they were making, I suppose, most of their money. So this is the kind of school in which a young Linda Givon was trained in 1964 and 1965. So when she returns to South Africa in 1966 and opens her famous Black Cube gallery in that year, and then later in 1967, 1968 opens the now famous Goodman Gallery, she is schooled in this European contemporary and modernist tradition. She is familiar with the likes of Lynn Chadwick, and she starts selling these artists into the local market, which is why there are so many of them still in local collections. So she starts selling works by Lynn Chadwick, and we have this fabulous diminutive work called Standing Figure in the Sale, showing you on the left. She starts selling works by Kenneth Armitage in the local market. And we have this work called The Forest by Armitage, a slightly later work, this from the 1960s, a very well-known, famous work by Kenneth Armitage. Elizabeth Frink, we don't have one of her boars, but we have this incredible Running Man, small-scale work. Elizabeth Frink, of course, famous for her horses and her hunting dogs and her very angular, planar animals, as well as the striding figures produced in small scale and double, triple, quadruple life size in bronze. Linda Givon also starts selling Henry Moore. In fact, she probably has a better trade in Henry Moore in the mid-1960s than any other artist. We don't have any Moore works on this sale, but we did sell this maquette square form with cut for just over R1 million in November 2017. But the important thing also is that while Linda Givon is selling these British modernists into the local market, she is introducing them to local art makers, and specifically Ezrom Legae and Sidney Kumalo, who in the late 1960s and early 1970s happened to move over to the Goodman Gallery. Egon Gunther in the late 1960s started retreating from dealing, and Linda Goodman, or Linda Givon, was ideally placed to take on these artists. She takes on Edoardo Villa, she takes on Cecil Scottness, she takes on Sidney Kumalo in the late 1960s, and she takes on Ezrom Legae in the early 1970s. And shortly thereafter, you start to see this British influence in the works of Kumalo and Legae specifically. Also, you have to realize that this is not just a selfish or a personal thing that maybe Linda Givon is doing, but she's also thinking about taking these artists global. She's looking at taking Kumalo and Legae and exhibiting them all around the world, which at the time must have been enormously exciting. But when you compare some of these artists' works, you'll notice the very, very clear influence. Henry Moore on the left with the sort of bulbous abstract figure, and Sidney Kumalo on the right, taking a Mapocha African figure and giving it a Moorish spirit. Similarly, Ezrom Legae on the left and Lynn Chadwick on the right. I think the influence is undeniable, which you also see in this fabulous pairing by Ezrom Legae, a slightly later work from 1990, his famous African goat on the left and she-goat on the right. I've never seen the pairing together. Some of you might remember that we had a casting of the African goat in a sale earlier this year, but I've never seen the two together. I have to say they really make an incredible pair. I'll show you a few different angles. Of course, he's looking closely at Lynn Chadwick, the attenuated figures, these spindly limbs, these angular udders, jagged kind of tailbones, shoulder bones, jaunty poses, these funny hooves, catching the ground at different angles, and of course these flat faces, which are related to African masks on the one hand, as well as Lynn Chadwick's faceted and often polished faces, for which he is now so famous. Also look at the fabulous patinas on these works, the wonderful tactile quality of them. They really are wonderful with their little antenna-like horns. Also, I have to say that when you compare them to the likes of The Prisoner from 1968, you can see that Ezrom Legae has moved on quite dramatically in his spirit. In the 60s and 70s, he was far more political and weighty in the kind of themes he was dealing with. But later on, and particularly with his series focusing on goats, he was far more playful, far more joyful, far more at ease and confident. And I think in some ways, much more entertaining. He is not only looking at Chadwick, he is looking at mega international precedents too. And of course, Pablo Picasso comes to mind with his famous she-goat from 1950, which is probably now most famous from the Museum of Modern Art. It's usually out in one of the courtyards there. Anyway, the Mandala series concludes in 1968, which incidentally coincides with another landmark moment in South African art making. I'm speaking specifically about Alexis Preller's period of experimentation around three-dimensional objects, fiberglass and resin works, often covered in gold leaf and oil paint. His series of works started in 1969 and continued up until his death in 1975, which are now known as his intaglios. I'm showing you arguably his most famous, his most important intaglio that we were lucky enough to repatriate and sell in November 2016, the famous Adam. Now, those of you who saw this work will never forget it. You'll remember its concave nature. It looks flat in an image like this, but it was at least 25 centimeters deep at its deepest. and it was an item that changed dramatically depending on the angle at which you viewed it from and the distance from which you viewed it. It would often appear concave, sometimes convex. It would collapse on itself depending on how you viewed it. So look at these different angles of the same work. It's quite remarkable in its living quality. This was produced in 1969, as was this, one of his famous apple works. He produced 3, and these are the first 3 intaglios he ever did. And you need to think how crazy Preller was experimenting in this incredible enigmatic medium out in Hartbeespoort Dam in the late 1960s. He's working with friends that are engineers. He's working with craftsmen. To conceive of this was quite remarkable. But in 1969, he produces Apple 1, Apple 2, and this is Apple 2, as well as a work called Original Sin. He also most likely would have produced this work called Craters, which is lot 871 on our sale. It is so bizarre, so strange, so unforgettable. We were so shocked when we saw it in images, and even more so when we saw it in the flesh. It is magical, it is strange, but it is very definitely from this late experimental period of Preller's career. It's undated, so we don't know if it was produced in 1969 or a bit later, maybe the early 1970s. What we do know is that it remained in the artist's estate after his death. After Preller died in 1975, the work went, all the works, his whole studio contents went to his lover at the time, Guna Massane, who tragically died about 8 or 9 days after Alexis. And the incredible irony was that the entire Preller estate went to Guna Massane's parents, who were deeply critical, deeply upset with their son's gay relationship with Alexis Preller. They wanted nothing to do with these works, and they sold them very famously at Falk's auctioneers in 1977 and 1978, landmark auctions in the South African art story. And this work, Craters, appeared in that 1977 auction at Falk's auctioneers. It was bought by the current owners and has been in their collection ever since. What is it? Well, it is, of course, this erupting subterranean landscape, these little volcanic elements with these fiery underbellies, these gold, yellow, marigold colors pushing through. It also has this wonderful turquoise, aquamarine, lavender sort of shade that runs throughout it. But in terms of its motifs, in terms of its source material, it harks back very definitely to Preller's wartime experiences. Preller joined the North African campaign in 1941. He was taken as a prisoner of war in Tobruk in 1942. He spent time in POW camps in Libya, in Egypt, in Italy, and he is decommissioned and returned to Pretoria in 1943. And the work he produces thereafter, up until about 1947, is very much wrapped up in wartime imagery. It is remarkable, however, that he revisits this wartime imagery nearly 25 years later. That is quite unusual for Preller. And whilst he has motifs being redeveloped throughout his career, he doesn't really go back to the out-and-out wartime imagery too often. But this work is very closely related to works like this, Revelation on the right, produced in 1945, and one of his famous parachutist work from 1944, 1945, I'm showing you top left. Revelation is similar to Craters in that, of course, it has that sort of background, probably Congo-inspired mountain. Preller saw the eruption of the Ngorongoro volcano when he was in the Belgian Congo when the war broke out in September of 1939. But he personifies the landscape in Revelation, just like he does in in Craters rather. The idea of the landscape being ripped and torn, like the bodies, like the societies that he witnessed during the war years. Also, you'll see the parachutist, which was a favorite motif for Preller during the time. These sometimes lifeless figures dropping from the skies and landing gently on this war-torn landscape. Where are the similarities? Well, look at those striations in Craters relating very closely, if inverted, to the parachute strings that you're seeing here, as well as in the top right of Revelation. Also, these three protrusions, these fangs, which were probably initially coming from sort of West African artworks that he was so interested in, but they also throw this wonderful parachute-like shadow over the work, depending on the angle at which you view it from. What Preller does in Craters, which is something really that only Preller could do, is he takes the horrific, he takes wartime horror and turns it into something beautiful and poetic. He did it famously in his landmark work called Fleur de Mal from 1944, and I would argue he does it again in Craters in the late 1960s or the early 1970s. Yes, he uses the same broad palette, the same motifs, and he takes this war-ravaged landscape and turns it into something aesthetically beautiful with wonderful lavenders and exploding flame-like marigold colors coming up from deep in the earth. It's a spectacular work, and those of you in Johannesburg, I do urge you to come and see it in the flesh. Looking at some other, I think, very important works in the sale. These three watercolors are by George Pember, produced in, 44, 47, and 1948. They are very early works, and to me, some of his most important, some of his most breathtaking, and some of his most skilled. Now, George Pember is best known for his later works, his oils, with this amazing cast of characters, sangomas, sort of beer swillers, urbanites, dancers, and his career spanned nearly 70 years. He started working in the late 1930s. But the work he produced in that first decade or 15 years of his career, when he was not a full-time professional artist, are arguably his most fresh and his most skillful and his most important. They are primarily in watercolor for a number of reasons. First and foremost, he couldn't afford oils. He'd never worked in oils in the 1930s. He was only introduced to oils in 1941, 1942, when he first met Gerard Sokoto and Maurice von Esch in Cape Town at that time. He remained working in watercolors throughout the 1940s. He also spent a lot of time traveling around South Africa in the 1940s, particularly in 1944 and in 1945, when he benefited from a number of scholarships and funds and trusts. He was determined to travel the country and to paint its people. He wanted to paint them in their traditional garb. He wanted to paint them in their contemporary or urbanite garb. He was interested in tradition. He was interested in modernity. And he captured this, I would argue, just like Frans Oorde would have captured the East African coast in 1903, just like Thomas Baines captured the interior in the mid-19th century. These are not only beautiful artworks, but of enormous topographical importance. We also have this sort of thumping later large-scale oil work by George Pember, a very important subject to the assassination of Shaka Zulu. These are the kind of works that are perhaps more familiar to collectors. You need to bear in mind that Pember was only really discovered by the commercial world in the 90s, when Everard Ries started showing some of his works in their Johannesburg gallery. Lot 834 is another very important work on our sale. It is by Peter Clarke, of course, a work titled, sort of tongue-in-cheek, "We Can't Stay in Bed Forever." I love this work for so many reasons. Peter Clarke's work always comes across as so joyful, so colorful, so playful, but there is a very real, deep set sense of resistance in Peter Clarke's work, and it's so often neglected, it's so often overseen, it's so often forgotten. And I think in a work like this, there's always a political undercurrent. He's talking about hiding, he's talking about cross-racial lovemaking and couples. He's talking about, obviously, the racial laws of the time. There are so many things going on in this very, very intimate moment. Also, of course, a work like this doesn't exist without Vincent van Gogh's Bedroom at Arles, or his various versions, from 1888, one of which the Chicago version I'm showing you on the right. And I love this comparison, not only because it's a very close comparison, but it shows that the artists like Peter Clarke, working in the mid-1970s, who have no international platform, sadly, they were entirely hamstrung by the cultural embargo at the time. They were still aware of art historical movements. They were still acutely aware of what was going on in terms of the avant-garde in Europe and in North America, and something like this shows it. Of course, the clear similarities are there, the personal pictures hanging up, the bed in this case made, but in Peter Clarke's version, sort of animated by this love-making couple. I also love the relatively similar palette, these very saucy, risque reds. He doesn't veer too much from it. He uses pinks, oranges, reds, blues, colors that would often maybe come across as jarring, but they really accentuate this sense of the intimate, but also of hiding that you get in a work like this. We have another Lovers by Peter Clarke in the sale, a work called Love in a Bleak Landscape. And again, I love the comparison because Peter Clarke is being very naughty in works like this. He's showing lovemaking outside, inside. I suppose he's giving the finger to societal or political authority. Ultimately, his lovers will do whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want to. Well, I've got a couple more minutes. I've probably got only 2 or 3 works to talk about, including this work, or this work is, these images are related to this work. And I'm showing you here Frida Feldman in about 1941, 1942, in her remarkably modern avant-garde home just up the road from our offices in Houghton. The home of Richard and Frida Feldman, so famed, so well known in Irma Stern circles. Now, Frida Feldman and Richard were major Stern confidants. They were patrons, and they were very dear, dear friends of the artist. They were also major collectors of Irma's works. They collected a group of astonishing examples from probably the late 1930s all the way up into the 1950s, many of which have been sold, I suppose, of the last generation. Irma Stern used to write to Richard and Frida religiously, often, whether from her home in Cape Town or from wherever she was around the world. And she used to visit them and stay with them in their home in Houghton whenever she was in Johannesburg to visit. On one such occasion in 1943, where incidentally she painted some pretty remarkable landmark paintings, she also happened to criticize the Feldmans' very modern fireplace around. You'll see it here, the sand-blasted sort of modern mantelpiece decorative scheme there, with its sort of geometric niche above it, holding various ceramics and trinkets. Irma thought it was ghastly. She told Frida, her host, as much. And Frida, as a bit of a throwaway comment, said, well, we'll paint over it, change it if you want. And one night, and I won't read you the entire description, but it's absolutely fabulous. It is remembered by an 8-year-old Mona Berman, or Mona Feldman at the time, who was awoken by this commotion downstairs. And she goes down and she sees Irma in the middle of the night in her large bathrobe and fluffy slippers, her hair unruly, cigarette in her mouth, paintbrushes in one hand, and a wooden palette in the other. And what she does is she starts looking at this modern fireplace scheme, and she starts painting over it. And she produces this spectacular Henri Matisse-inspired frieze of dancing figures and musicians. She does it in a moment. She does it in a few hours late at night. She does it in a very special home, a very intimate space of one of her great, great patrons and friends. This is not only a beautiful piece, but it is a wonderful historical artifact, really, that has been in the family ever since it was produced in 1943. I mentioned Matisse, Naturally, it is related to his famous dance, conceived in 1909. I'm showing you the 1909 slightly paler version on the right, and the perhaps more famous one, I think it's what's in the Hermitage, done in 1910. And of course, Irma's fireplace can't exist without these free dancing figures that Matisse conceived at the time. I have to say that there's a wonderful tradition of these Matisse-like figures in South African art. I don't have time to go through them, but these are some examples by the likes of Zoltan Borberecki, Lippi Lipschitz, Eugene Labuschagne, as well, of course, as from Walter Battis. Finally, I've got, what, 3 or 4 more minutes. I've got 2 fabulous works by this photographed elder man. This is Robert Hodgins. I never met Robert Hodgins. It's one of these things that infuriate me because so many of my colleagues met him and knew him well. Wilhelm van Rensburg knew him very, very well, worked with him at Arts on Paper, watched him work, which must have been an enormous privilege. We have a number of works by Hodgins in the sale. Well, in fact, if you include all the ceramics, we might have 30 odd works by Robert Hodgins. But my favorite is this. It's a work called Samurai, and it's in our Johannesburg office. And again, if you haven't seen it or haven't been to the view, go and look at this work. It has everything you want from Robert Hodgins. It's a relatively early-ish painting in terms of his professional career. It's from 1987, but it is violent, it is furious, it is aggressive. It has these wonderful fiery oranges and reds in the background, this terrifying samurai mask with its pink markings all around it, these terrifying teeth, these ubu-like hands protruding, clawing into the picture space, this phallic savage sword in this sort of glowing blue, and these sort of prisoners maybe in the background. Also, this figure seems to be decapitated, and you have no idea what has happened other than violence. And Hodgins has this wonderful conflation of violence and humor in his work, not only in his imagery, but in his color palette too. There are very few finer out-and-out colorists and painters than Robert Hodgins in our South African story. And to me, this is a fabulous example. My final example is also Robert Hodgins, and it is this incredible Attic head. It is a ceramic. I hope you would have noticed that we have a focus on South African ceramics, and I suppose the artist best represented or most represented is Robert Hodgins, and this is absolutely my favorite work. It is ultimately a plate, and it has this Attic style head. And when I say Attic, I'm talking about Athens, of course, and it also has a wonderful link to classical art history when you think of red figure pottery and red figure and black figure making in the ancient Greek tradition. I'm showing you a black figure vase on the top left here, a tradition really from the 7th century BC to about the 5th century BC, and the red figure pot making, which started in about the 5th century BC in Greece. Wonderfully accurate, beautifully linear works, and Robert Hodgins is obviously riffing off these historical precedents. The point I'd like to make as my final one before I end off is the wonderful variety you get, particularly in our North-South sale that starts on Sunday with the wine session. Not only in terms of interest and in terms of breadth of aesthetic interest, various genres, but also, of course, in terms of price points. Samurai is 500,000 rands worth of Robert Hodgins, a fabulous canvas that is worth every single rand. But his Attic head, his fabulous ceramic, is far more modestly priced. People don't realize that these Hodgins ceramics are unique works. He sat with these ceramics, he painted them by hand, he oversaw their glazing, oversaw their firing. These are original works that can be hung up just like any canvas. R500,000 samurai on the left. The attic head, I think, is starting at 13,000 Rand, which just shows you how pathetically undervalued our ceramic market is here in South Africa. I urge you to look at the ceramics. There are incredible deals to be had, and I can't imagine these deals lasting too much longer. The sooner people realize you can have an original Hodgins hanging on your wall for 10 or 15 or 20,000 Rand, the sooner these prices will rocket upwards. Okay, well, that's it. Bang on 5 o'clock, which is unusual for me. So I will stop there, but I'm very happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
There's a chat function if you would like to put a question there, or you can unmute your mic. In the meantime, thank you, Alastair. That was such a wonderful talk and just such a wonderful overview, especially on, you know, all the sculptures, the ceramics. Like you said, it's so wonderful to actually have this whole ceramic section and focus on all these magnificent items. And also the Hodgins plates, how they're actually displayed. We've got a little cube with a wall filled with these plates, and I think just the viewing of it itself is just magnificent. I didn't see any.
Yeah, but finally, sorry, my dogs are barking now. Well, I was just trying to say, please come to our views in Cape Town, in Brickfields, and in Johannesburg, in our offices. Everything is on show there, and please come and have a look.
Yeah, and we will be here on Saturday until 1 o'clock, from 9:30 until 1 o'clock. So you're more than welcome to come on Saturday, and obviously the wine auction starts on Sunday. If there's no questions, then thank you everyone for joining. If you'd missed any parts, this will be uploaded on YouTube later this evening. If you've missed any of our previous talks, they're also up on YouTube, along with a number of other videos. All the catalogs are online. Come through and view our viewing rooms. And if you can't come through, we also have 3D galleries that you can walk through virtually that you can get from our website.
Thank you, Alastair. Thank you, Strauss.
Thank you.
No, absolute pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.